For more than 50 years, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations has been the leader in promoting mutual understanding between the United States and China, the most important relationship of the 21st century. The National Committee strengthens that relationship by helping people on both sides of the Pacific to understand one another better and to address issues of mutual concern through exchanges, dialogues, and other activities.
Between the United States and China in 1979. As the relationship undergoes enormous changes, the major constant is that all agree that U.S.-China relations will help determine the peace and prosperity of the 21st century. Through these changes, the National Committee has steadfastly believed that understanding China and crafting good policies based on that understanding would make Americans more prosperous and secure. We started Chinatown Hall 15 years ago in the hope of educating Americans throughout the country about China. Over the years, we have hosted former presidents, secretaries of state, national security advisors, and ambassadors to China. This year, for the first time, we have invited a journalist to serve as our speaker. At a time when all too often traditional media focuses on the headline and a 3-minute story, Dr. Fareed Zakaria looks at the issues in depth and truly educates his viewers. This should come as no surprise, as Dr. Zakaria is the award-winning host of Fareed Zakaria GPS for CNN Worldwide, a Washington Post columnist, and a best-selling author of 7 books, including the recently published 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. We are thrilled to have him here with us today, and I am happy I can play Fareed Zakaria to Fareed Zakaria and interview the interviewer. I would also like to thank our speakers at our 88 venues who are leading voices on U.S. foreign policy in China, as well as our partners across the United States and China for hosting this event. Thank you also to the Henry Luce Foundation for its continued generosity in funding Chinatown Hall, and to our National Committee staff for working tirelessly to coordinate this event. Fareed, thank you so much for being here. Let me jump right into the questions. As I mentioned in my introduction, this is kind of the low point for U.S.-China relations since before we established diplomatic relations in 1979. Should the average American be concerned? How does it affect the average American's lives?
Well, first, thanks for having me. Steve, it's a huge pleasure to be here. Yes, I think the average American should be concerned because the cliches are true. This is going to be the most important relationship of the 21st century. It's going to define the 21st century. It's the biggest new thing that has happened to the international system, really in 100 years, right? If you think about the rise and fall of great powers as being one of those great engines of change, turmoil, revolution, well, the rise of China is on that scale. 20 years ago, China was 1% of global GDP. It's now about 15% of global GDP. There's virtually no country has had as dramatic a rise, and it's probably headed toward 20% of global GDP, which is roughly where the United States is. So the 21st century is going to be defined by these two powers. And what's interesting is you'll notice after the two of them, there's a big drop-off. So China is the number 2 economy in the world, but it's larger than number 3, number 4, number 5, and number 6 put together. Similarly, defense budget. U.S. is, of course, number 1, China is number 2, but the Chinese defense budget is larger than the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th put together. So that's why I tend to think we're back in a bipolar world. You know, a world in which these two superpowers, one clearly bigger than the other, the United States by far the number 1, but they outrank everyone else. And the question for the 21st century is going to be, can these two superpowers find a way to coexist, to cooperate, to compete, but to do so within the framework of a strategic relationship that recognizes there are huge costs to going down a path that leads us to another Cold War. And if we can get that right, and this is on both sides, this is not, you know, we tend to often think of as though America is the only actor here. Obviously, China gets a vote on this too. But if we can do that, I think you could imagine a 21st century that's quite different from one that ends up being filled with arms races, conflict, proxy wars. You know, that's the thing people forget about the Cold War is the degree to which it transformed and warped not just international life, but the life of every, you know, the average person in these countries. And so those are the stakes. We're going to live in a bipolar 21st century. Bipolarity is a given. A Cold War is a policy choice for both countries.
But would you say we are in a Cold War now?
No, I don't think.
I think that's a long discussion in
I think
that's paper these days.
So the fundamental structural driver of the Cold War was, let's remember, Stalin's decision to essentially invade all of Eastern Europe, not quite invade, but the Red Army had liberated those places from the Nazis, to install puppet regimes there, then to try to go south into Greece and Turkey. And that then provokes a reaction from Western Europe and the United States, and thus begins the Cold War. So when you think about China, it has not yet done anything on that scale. And more importantly, the Soviet Union and the United States were kind of hermetically sealed from one another economically, even culturally, even during World War II. The peak year of trade between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War was about $2 billion of trade a year. The United States and China do $2 billion of trade every day. Right. And even, it might surprise people watching to know, in the last couple of months, we have been buying more stuff from China rather than less, despite all the geopolitical tensions. And that gets at a kind of fundamental reality of today's world, which is it is deeply interdependent in a very complicated way. So, you know, nobody decided that they wanted to have closer economic ties with China over the last 3 months. In fact, both sides have, you know, in many ways the governments are trying in their way to untangle themselves a little bit. But here's what happened. Americans stopped going to the gym and started to buy Pelotons. Well, guess where Pelotons are made? They're made in China. So you see, we're both locked into such an interdependent relationship that things happen without anyone wanting them to. And by the way, that's one of the glories of the complexity of a kind of open trading system in the world, that, you know, you can get stuff from everywhere, you can interact with lots of people. And if we did really go down the path of a Cold War, I think all that would unravel. It would become, and in the worst case scenario, we go back to isolated autarkic economies and a huge amount of conflict and confrontation.
Your defense statistic is interesting because I often hear it that the United States defense budget exceeds the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh countries combined. But you talk about it that China's exceeds those next five also.
Yeah.
By the way, a very different way of looking at it.
That also happens to be true. The U.S. is so much higher. You know, I mean, the U.S. spends about $750 billion. China spends about $250 or something like that. And then it really drops off, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
But and it's important to point out, you know, the Chinese have been building up, they've been expanding their military spending significantly. So it's not that there aren't reasons to be concerned. And again, it's not that the Chinese have not done things that should cause alarm. They have, and particularly under Xi. But the question is, you know, do we have, for the United States, this is a very difficult challenge. The United States is very comfortable historically either withdrawing from the international system or dominating it. Withdrawing from the international system is Washington's farewell address. Just, you know, keep out of that damned European continent with all its ills and duplicity and Machiavellian machinations. John Quincy Adams says, you know, we don't want to go around the world looking for monsters to destroy. Domination is post-World War II, right? We basically built the international system in our image. The challenge is going to be for the next 100 years maybe, we're going to have to find a way to live within a system where we're still number one, but we don't embody the system. We're not so far above everybody else. And China, in that sense, becomes the principal country that is a rival. You know, in some ways, we've had it lucky. In the last 60 years, 70 years, the two countries that rose economically to quasi-great power status economically were Japan and Germany, both in a sense returning. But you know, it didn't change the geopolitics of the world at all because both were American allies. Both existed within the American security umbrella. Both were closely tied to the U.S. by treaty. So China is really the first great power to have risen into this post-World War II system that we built that is not a Western ally, that is not an American, I mean, honestly, the Japan and Germany could be described as American satellites. You know?
Yeah, and both were functioning democracies. Which perfectly lead into the first question from the audience, which is from Daniel Yu of the American Bar Association, and he asks, how do we balance our economic and business interests that you've referred to, desiring Chinese cooperation on global health and climate change, potential threats towards Western values such as human rights, democracy, regional and international peace? And obviously he's referring to Hong Kong and Xinjiang also.
It's a big question. In a way, it is the central question, which is it's all. How should we conduct our relations with China given the opportunity challenges, right? So the way I would put it is, I think that there are some areas where you have to search for a win-win solution and for cooperation with the Chinese because everyone is better off that way. Trade is a perfect example. The Chinese do cheat on trade, and they are protectionist on trade. By the way, so are we. The United States, Europe have massive agricultural subsidies, for example. We have all everything the Biden administration is doing with regard to this Build Back Better plan, the Buy America provisions in that, are protectionist. They are against the spirit of the World Trade Organization. They would probably be found in violation if somebody brought them, you know. So there's a very good tally of this, and it points out in the last 20 years, the U.S. has put in place more protectionist measures than any country in the world, very much including China. China is not even second. I think it's Brazil, India, then maybe China is seventh. So China has many non-market features that are a huge problem. But I believe that there are win-win solutions here because the Chinese also want trade. They also want to be able to be a player in a system in which they're increasingly moving up the value chain. So filer of patents as a single company in the world last year was Huawei. So China is now getting to the point where it doesn't want intellectual property stolen because it's generating a lot of intellectual property. So there's that whole bunch of areas where there are real disagreements. The obvious thing to do is for the US, Europe, and Japan to get together, come up with a common negotiating position and push hard with the Chinese. Then there are areas where the Chinese are trying to erode norms, values, national system, human rights, the issues relating to whether or not there should be pushback from outside the world when you renege on a treaty or an agreement like Hong Kong, which it does not have some kind of clear legal status, but the Chinese government did promise in the handover documents to the British that they would honor a kind of one country, two system model, which they have not. So on those ones, I think the United States, the West in general, should stand tough. I mean, I think we should not compromise. We should not pretend these issues don't exist. We should air the differences. We should, hold them accountable in the sense that we can. Again, always better to do this with other countries than by ourselves. But I fear that this balance that the question was asking about is politically very difficult to do. When Truman outlined to Senator Vandenberg, the Republican whose support he was trying to get, that he wanted to have a strategy towards the Soviet Union that we now call containment, Vandenberg said to him, Mr. President, the only way this will work is if you go on TV and scare the hell out of the American people. Otherwise, we're not going to be. And my fear is that, in order to get some of the things people want to get on the more confrontational side, you're going to exaggerate the threat, minimize the areas for cooperation. And that could lead us down a very dangerous path, because one thing we must always keep in mind in this conversation is China is not some inanimate object out there. It's got its own politics, it's got its own culture, it's got its own society. So when we do things, it has an impact on them.
Yep. Let's go to our first question from the audience, from Catherine Ng, who is right here in New York City, and she'll be on video.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm calling in from New York City. My question is about U.S. shifting Asia priorities and relations with Europe. Since the Obama administration, the U.S. has been trying to pivot to Asia, but without too much success. We're now at a moment where the country is able to shift more completely to Asia, but is also straining alliances along the way. For example, we withdrew from Afghanistan, but at a bit of a cost there. The US signed an AUKUS deal that left France upset. It seems like in the Biden administration's hurry to tee up the China strategy and compete with China, that it's causing Europeans to feel the relationship with the US is a bit transactional, and perhaps it's fueling strategic autonomy as well. And yet, a strong European coalition is necessary to effectively confront China. How would you evaluate Biden's China policy as it currently stands? Thank you.
Sure, it's a good question. I would say that she accurately described some of the costs along the way as the Biden administration has been trying to pivot to Asia. As she points out, the pivot really began with Bush, the younger Bush's outreach to India with the nuclear deal, which was a big, an extraordinary reversal of U.S. policy. For 35 years, we had punished the Indians for having a nuclear weapon, and then we normalized it, and it was largely because there was the desire to bring India into the fold. Then the Obama pivot to Asia, so articulated, putting troops in Australia, a kind of base in the Philippines, all of which then led to what the Biden administration has tried to do. As usual, Trump is a kind of weird aberration where he doesn't really quite have a policy. It's schizophrenic. One day he loves Xi Jinping, the other day he's bashing him. I would say that the Biden policy is very much a continuation along these lines. And yeah, there was some bruised feelings. Some of those you could have then dealt with better. The Afghanistan withdrawal could have been handled a bit better. The AUKUS deal could have been handled better. But the fundamental direction, I think, is correct, which is that the United States should be shoring up the alliances in Asia that will allow it to deter Chinese aggression, to maintain an American presence in the Pacific. And by and large, I think the driver there has been Chinese behavior. So you look at two places in particular, Australia and India. In both cases, the Australians were trying to play a game of having it both ways, of having very close economic ties with the Chinese and close geopolitical ties with the Americans. The Indians were trying to be very passive, and they were willing to kind of go along with things like the Quad as long as there was no military component, as long, they would often send a very junior minister to those meetings. And then the Chinese under Xi became, much more aggressive, issuing the set of demands to Australia, in the case of India, having that border skirmish. And in both places, the domestic politics have changed. As a result, the foreign policy has changed. And there is much more of a sense of kind of inviting the U.S. to play a role to help these countries feel like they're not on their own. So I think it's, broadly speaking, been successful. One point I'd make about Europe, yes, we need to make sure that there's a way to pivot toward Asia that is both taking the Europeans along and through Europe in a sense, as opposed to against Europe. There is going to be some concern on their part that they're being abandoned. I think it's actually, the way to point it out is it's largely good news. It means Europe is not the cockpit of potential war. I mean, that was the issue in the Cold War, was people worried that the Soviet Union was going to move millions of men through Europe, through the Fulda Gap in Germany to kind of conquer Europe. That concern is largely gone, though of course Putin does represent a threat to places like the Baltic states and Poland and Ukraine. But the action has moved to Asia, so naturally U.S. foreign policy should move there. Europe will never act, final point, because you mentioned, Europe will never be a strategic actor. That is a bridge too far. It is an extraordinary, the European Union is an extraordinary achievement, the most extraordinary sustained institutionalized cooperation among countries that have fought each other for 400 or 500 years. But they will never become one country. I mean, Berlin and Paris will never subcontract their foreign policy.
We have a question relating to the increase in kind of anti-Asian violence in the United States, anti-Asian activity in the United States, from Alice in Austin, Texas.
I'm Alice E. from Austin, Texas. I plan to watch the town hall with our Austin Asian Community Civic Coalition members. Here are my questions. FBI wrongfully accused many Chinese scientists before, like Wenhou Li, Sherry Chen, and many, many more. If U.S.-China relationship going backwards, what challenges are we going to face as a Chinese American living in U.S.?
Yeah, it's a very real concern. Part of it is that once you sharpen the divisions and the geopolitical tensions rise, it becomes much easier for people to start suspecting and being suspicious and casting doubt on the loyalty of Chinese Americans in ways that are completely unfair. You already see it happening. People like Mike Pompeo and other Republicans have been accusing universities of becoming hotbeds of spying activity. Again, very rarely do they have specific charges or let alone proof, but these are easy things to say, and I think we should be aware that this is a challenge that Chinese Americans have faced almost uniquely among Asian Americans because of the Asian Exclusion Acts, the Chinese labor that was brought in, the way in which they have been historically discriminated against. So it's very easy to bring up, if you scratch these tendencies, it's very easy to bring up a certain amount of racism and xenophobia. I worry a lot about this. If you look back over American history, America reacts badly when it gets scared. When we get scared, we lash out, whether it's at the Irish, Jews, the Chinese, the Red Scare, McCarthyism, even after 9/11, some of the attacks on Muslims. If we were instead, again, to be calm, sensible, pragmatic, understand this is a challenging relationship, it's not just better for the relationship, better for the world, but we don't distort our own values and our own society in the pursuit of some confrontation abroad.
Yeah, I think the good news on this is that the Asian American Pacific Islander community has actually begun to organize, and we've seen responses. Some charges have been dropped. We saw this case at the University of Tennessee, Professor where the federal judge ultimately threw out the case, and then this past weekend, the University of Tennessee reinstated the professor. So we're beginning to see progress, and we're seeing letters from Stanford, from MIT, professors at Stanford, from MIT, objecting to using race or Asian heritage as a basis for any kind of investigation. Let's talk a little bit about, you wrote this very interesting piece about normalizing many of the normalizing many of the Trump administration's foreign policies. And you talk about Cuba, you talk about Iran, you talk about others. But for China, so tariffs, delisting of Chinese companies from U.S. stock exchanges, visa restrictions, journalist restrictions, state-owned media restrictions in the United States. Why are these still in place?
There's something about Donald Trump that I think people most don't quite understand. He's very clever and in sensing the political mood. So in all of these areas, Cuba policy, Iran policy, and China policy, he changed the default position. He changed the operating position, and it turns out it's politically very hard to reverse it, because take Cuba as a simple example. If Biden were to try and reverse Cuba policy right now, Senator Robert Menendez, the ranking Democrat the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, would be appalled. He's very hawkish on Cuba. Now Biden needs his vote on these two big bills that are coming up, right? So on China, I think that Biden criticized the tariffs throughout the campaign, in my opinion, completely correctly and intelligently, pointing out, A, Americans were paying the cost for the tariffs, 100% right. B, they were not working, 100% right. And C, by the way, you could point out that it hasn't changed Chinese behavior at all. But were he to reverse them, you will see the barrage of tweets from Marco Rubio and Josh Hawley and things like that. Now, my own view is that is a mistake, because I think that, first of all, policy toward China is too important to play the politics with. You should try to figure out what the right thing to do is and do it. And secondly, those guys are going to attack you no matter what. I don't think I need to tell President Biden, we're living in a very polarized country. And if he wants to get a glimpse of that, watch the way in which Republican senators reacted to Biden's summit meeting with Putin, which was a pretty normal summit. They exchanged the usual free and frank exchange. The Fox News and Republican senators literally described it as Munich, as Biden having appeased Putin in a way that was going to lead to a world war. It was fantastical, right? And so if you're going to get attacked as being Neville Chamberlain at Munich when you have a routine bilateral with Putin, you're going to be attacked on your China policy no matter what. So you might as well do the right thing, because you're going to pay the political price of being pummeled from the right anyway.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the actual inflation that is now occurring in the United States, combined with the beginning of the progressive Democrats advocating for an ending of the tariffs because of their regressive nature, the people who are most affected by these tariffs are poorer Americans? Do you think we'll see a reversal of that? And we're seeing Ambassador Tai speaking with Vice Premier Liu He. You think we'll see some of these tariffs get ended?
I think you're beginning to see the reestablishment of real dialogue, which is very good. You're seeing the reestablishment of some kind of strategic relationship. I still think the Biden administration doesn't know how to handle the politics of the China relationship. Look, to be fair to them, part of the problem is they will have very few allies on the Democratic side either. I mean, you know, you look at Chuck Schumer, you look at Nancy Pelosi, you're not going to find, there used to be in the US Senate in particular, a kind of group of wise men who had a broader strategic national security orientation, the Sam Nunns of the world, the Daniel Patrick Moynihans of the world, Lugar, and people like that. Those people don't exist anymore. And so what you have now is a much more political, partisan Senate. And so I think Biden is trying to figure out whether or not there's space there. My sense is maybe they would do it in the context of some kind of overall agreement where where the Chinese also make some concessions. But unfortunately, I don't see much movement. And as you say, it's highly regressive. These tariffs are basically taxes that are paid for by middle class and working class Americans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in an inflationary environment, it's a good way to actually reduce pressure for inflation. Let's talk about some of the shared challenges that the United States and China are confronting, especially climate change. We have questions. We have a partnership with the Schwarzman Scholars Program at Tsinghua University, and two of their students have submitted some questions on the topic of climate cooperation. So if we could hear from them.
Hi, Fareed. My name is John Rendon. I'm from Brooklyn, New York, and the 5th cohort of Schwarzman Scholars. I'm here representing Meetup Chinese Group in Charlotte, North Carolina. My question concerns climate change. In the past, we heard climate change mentioned alongside pandemic control and prevention as an area where the United States and China, no matter their differences, could cooperate and find common ground. Yet the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic showed us that the differences between China and the United States state interests and government systems made that cooperation very difficult, if not disappointing. Why should we expect climate change to be different? Thanks.
Hi, my name is Alliance, and I'm currently a Schwarzman Scholar at Tsinghua University residing in Beijing in China. Leading up to the COP26 conference at the end of this month, my question is, knowing that both China and the US are global superpowers with key roles in helping achieving a net zero future. So what are the immediate actions that both countries have to take in order to ensure that we're en route to a sustainable climate change future? Thank you.
Well, they're both very good questions. And the first one pointedly says, why has this been so difficult? And I think the reason it's difficult is because it's actually not an area where you are going to get much because of a treaty or an agreement between the two sides. On this issue, I dissent a little bit from the conventional wisdom. The Chinese are going to do what they want to do and what they need to do to get their emissions down for their own reasons. They're not going to do them because the United States forces Beijing to do it. And the same is true of the United States. These are decisions largely made by countries because of their own sense of commitment and political pressure or societal pressure. And the Chinese have been doing a certain amount because there has been a lot of concern in China about dirty air and dirty water and such. But I don't quite see where the opportunity for a win-win here is, in the sense that the Chinese are going to reduce emissions if they want to, and the Americans are going to reduce emissions if they want to, and maybe they'll get together in places like Paris, the Paris Accords, which are entirely voluntary, and they can symbolically commit to them. I think that the area for cooperation would be really if there were efforts to help the poorer countries in the world get to green energy faster, and rather than being completely competitive about it, to find ways to help with project financing and things like that. Right now, we're going about it in an entirely competitive way. The Chinese do their Belt and Road Initiative. The United States is trying to offer various other forms and is trying to counter that. That's probably suboptimal. But I have to say, my my biggest concern right now about climate change, this takes us off the topic of US-China slightly, but is we are all committed and committing to a world in which we are going to phase out these fossil fuels very fast. And so there's very little investment going in, a lot of shaming of it, a lot of winding down of natural gas, for example, in the US. But we don't have green technology at the scale we needed. And most importantly, in what utility would call in terms of base load capacity, in other words, the always-on energy that an electric utility needs to provide electricity when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. And right now what you're seeing are very big gaps between, you're winding down fossil fuel, but you're not ramping up, we can't ramp up green enough. And that's why you have these blackouts in places like California. That's why you have this energy crisis in Britain. My fear is we are, this is not something you can just aspirationally wish for. It needs a lot of very careful planning. If you are going to take one power plant offline because it's coal-fired or natural gas-fired, you have to have something that replaces it kilowatt for kilowatt. You have to find those sources, and if you can't find them, you have to keep the fossil fuel on for a little bit longer. Move from coal to gas because it's half the emissions. These are difficult trade-offs, but with regard to this subject, people assume if your intentions are good, the problem is going to solve itself. It won't. It takes a lot of implementation to make this work.
But certainly sharing of technologies in this area would be beneficial. Sharing of technologies to protect cities, creating smarter cities. We've seen floods right here in New York. We've seen terrible floods in China, where we've seen significant deaths in the metro. So kind of sharing technologies in that area would certainly be useful. And we're seeing an energy crisis, a power shortage in China, which is based upon, I think, their attempt to wean themselves off of fossil fuels and go to alternative energy. That's part of it.
Exactly. For them, they're facing a similar situation. Coal is going down, and they don't have quite the supply of what. But
that's part of the reason. Yeah.
Some part of this, yes, you're right. Best practices is the way I would put it with regard to urban policy, with regard to flood control, hurricanes. There's a role for competition of ideas. If Chinese companies are trying one technique for battery storage and U.S. companies are trying one, that's good old-fashioned capitalism.
Yeah.
And you will end up with more interesting optimal solutions if they are actually competing against each other.
Yeah. In your recent book, you talk about kind of the impact of the varying impacts of COVID. I got something years ago. I always believed that climate change and economic crisis and terrorism and pandemic would bring the United States and China together. It would force us to cooperate. Didn't happen with COVID. What happened, and what are the implications of it for U.S.-China relations?
It's a great question, because I too would have guessed that something like the pandemic could have had that effect. And I think two things happened, and it's one of those kind of, some parts of history are determined by large structural forces, and sometimes there is the accident, the peculiarity that makes things go in the direction they go. The peculiarity here was the COVID started in China. And the Chinese were very secretive and deceptive about it in its origins. I should point out, most countries, when an epidemic has started in that country, tend to be a little bit reluctant to share information. They feel guilty, they're defensive. If you look at SARS, MERS, Ebola, all of these have that characteristic. But in China, I think it was more pronounced because it is a very secretive, top-down, closed, command Leninist party. So there's no question. That poisoned the atmosphere. The second piece is that the Trump administration massively miscalculated in its COVID strategy. It thought that the virus would go away. It thought that any kind of economic lockdown would be foolish and not worth doing. It sort of took it was not an entirely crazy idea. It took the view that, look, we'll ride this out. The virus will wane the way that SARS did wane and MERS did wane, but they turned out to be wrong. So they confronted a full-blown pandemic, and then Trump's basic response to everything is blame somebody else. And so the whole Trump strategy became blame China, poison relations. Until then, he had been playing this schizophrenic game where one day he loved Xi, one day he bashed him. The COVID thing completely transformed it. And Trump is very good with public opinion, and he knew exactly how to play it, to turn the pandemic into the China virus, the Wuhan flu, all that kind of thing. And that took us in a place where cooperation became impossible. I mean, it's strange because the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union cooperated to jointly inoculate the world from smallpox. And the eradication of smallpox was an extraordinary example of superpower cooperation at the height of the Cold War. This was in the 50s, so pre the arms control. This was at the point where people thought the United States and the Soviet Union could fight a nuclear war. And at that very point, they were cooperating on global public health.
Yeah.
We can't do it right now.
Yeah, it was one of the disappointments. We, of course, had reduced our medical presence in China. Prior to that, we had people from our CDC embedded in China's CDC, from our National Science Foundation, and in 2017 and 18 they got withdrawn, which didn't help us understand what had occurred when COVID started.
And Steve, that's an important point about how to influence China. This is a huge country, civilization, 5,000 years old, now very rich and powerful. Some part of how we will get them to do things we think are right and not do bad things is going to be deterrence, is to be strong, be tough, push back. But some of it surely is also going to be cooperation, being there, involving ourselves, getting to know people, getting to as you said, our CDC, their CDC, our SEC working with their SEC. For two reasons. One, you do build some trust and goodwill. Secondly, you have some familiarity with what's going on in that place. And finally, they don't want to break the bonds either. They also, interdependence creates a certain kind of asymmetrical power for you. They don't want to get it all to be cut off and isolated. So the threat of pulling people out could be one of your bargaining chips. If we isolate them completely, if we isolate ourselves completely, we lose much leverage over them. I mean, one of the things that I've always pointed out to people is we keep sanctioning countries with whom we have no contact. North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, and then Cuba, and then we're surprised that the sanctions don't work. Well, they don't hurt very much if the countries actually have very little dealing with one another. So keeping the bonds actually in a weird way gives us more leverage.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about trade and investment. As you've pointed out, it's enormous and so important. And let's go back to the Obama years when Obama had led the negotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a high standard trade and investment agreement. Secretary Clinton and President Trump decided they were going to withdraw from it, and then President Trump won the election, and he did withdraw from it. As you pointed out in a wonderful story, the day after the United States announced its partnership with Australia and the United Kingdom to provide Australia for, I think, $60 billion with nuclear-propelled subs. China, the day after, applied for accession to what was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's kind of got amended somewhat, and it now exists with 11 countries, including Australia and Japan. Some of our closest allies. You and I believe this is a big deal, but people don't much share our view. Why? What's going on here?
Well, economics always kind of goes under the radar. Trade economics in particular is so arcane and complicated and obscure that people don't pay attention. But of course, it is often the big thing that undergirds relations. So, it's possible that what's going on here is that the Chinese realized that the real threat that they faced was not an American aircraft carrier, but was that the United States was bringing together all the major economies in Asia in this Trans-Pacific Partnership, which were then going to have a kind of counterweight to China, and we're going to be able to write the agenda, write the rules, whether it's intellectual property, trade practices, and such. And so once America foolishly, in a sense, commits the own goal of withdrawing from a trade treaty that it had sponsored, imagined, dreamed up, corralled these other 11 countries into doing, the Chinese were like, well, maybe we should get involved. Now, I don't think China will be led into the TPP, but it's a kind of clever move, and it highlights the cost that the United States is paying in not being part of the TPP. The TPP basically opened up markets like Japan to America that had long been closed. It actually had many concessions on wages, on environmental issues that the left wanted and were able to get. It's a remarkably progressive trade treaty, but again, Trump poisoned the atmosphere so much that it became impossible to get out of it. If things continue to go south, though, I do think the Chinese will, whether formally through the mechanism of joining the TPP or not, they will take advantage. If America retreats more and more into isolation and protectionism, the Chinese benefit because the rest of the world can't afford to do that. The U.S. is still a vast domestic economy. We think we're very globalized. We're not. 80% of the U.S. economy is a domestic economy. Trade is only 20% of our economy. But you go to Thailand, you go to Malaysia, you go to Singapore, you go to Taiwan, these countries are entirely dependent on trade. Even Germany, 50% of German GDP is trade.
But you're thinking that China will never get in, or will not get in for the next decade?
There's a provision in there that says non-market economies can't join, and there is significant, I think there's enough reality to China not having a real market economy. And secondly, given where the Australians are and the Japanese are right now, they would veto it, is my guess. I think it would take either significant reforms or significant cajoling from the Chinese. I think the Chinese have, we've talked a lot about American policy. Xi has fundamentally misunderstood how to handle his Asian neighbors. I think that the Xi approach has been be very strong, be very tough, and you will command their respect. It's not working. It's having exactly the opposite impact. I can tell you, intimately knowing the India story, the Indians were really not very anti-Chinese. They were being pushed by the U.S. to get more involved with the Quad. And then Xi launches this skirmish in the Himalayas, this border.
It's not clear what happened.
It's not clear what happened.
We don't know what happened. Nobody's explained it well.
What we know is that the Chinese and the Indians fought hand to hand because they'd been luckily told not to use weapons. The Chinese ended up with 20 square miles of additional territory. But this is like frozen wasteland tundra territory. I don't know what they would do with it. But as a result, it completely changed India's foreign policy toward China. They banned hundreds of Chinese apps. They've essentially banned all Chinese investment into the country. And they are now much more actively participating, even at a defense level, with the Quad. So I would put it to Xi Jinping, was it worth it? You got 20 miles of frozen tundra and you changed, the foreign policy of 1.2 to 1.3 billion people.
I would argue the same with respect to the South China Sea,
right.
That the consequences of China's actions in the South China Sea and the benefits that they derive don't outweigh the costs
right.
that it's created in terms
right.
of unifying the Asian countries with the United States in opposition to China's
right. There's a familiar dynamic in international relations, which is balancing. Countries first try to balance against a rising power, rising threat. Only if they feel they cannot balance, then they jump on the bandwagon. So the truth is, because of America in large part, these countries can balance. They can balance China. And so as long as that dynamic is at play, China, Deng Xiaoping was very wise. When he outlined China's relations to the world and sort of said, hide your light under a bushel. I think it wasn't just that he was saying we're weak right now. I think Deng understood that China is not the United States. The United States grew to great world power surrounded by two vast oceans and two weak neighbors. Right? Sorry to the Mexicans and Canadians listening. China is growing rich and powerful in the middle of Asia. It has 16 neighbors and 16 border disputes, and all these countries watch the rise of China and they get anxious, and managing that rise is a task worthy of a Bismarck, and Xi Jinping is no Bismarck.
Why? And then I want to get off of CPTPP, but during the Obama administration, national security professionals, so our armed forces, the Secretary of Defense said that, joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership was more valuable than a bunch of aircraft carrier groups, that it really created another pillar for America's presence in Asia. There's really silence today from our national security professionals on that. Some of the, folks who work on economics said this would be good for America. The net growth in jobs is easy to quantify. This would be good. But there's not a bunch of national security folks who said this would be great for what the first questioner asks, our pivot to Asia.
I think it's an important question, and it's fundamentally because trade has become a dirty word in Washington, because everybody thinks that it is by focusing on trade and globalization and neglecting the American worker whose wages have declined, that is what got us Donald Trump, that is what got us this wave of populism, and so everyone is sort of genuflecting to what they see as this political atmosphere. The truth is, the United States did not open itself up blindly to trade over the last 20 years. We have actually not opened up our economy as much as other countries. We're the laggard. And as I said, we have more protectionist measures in place. Many of those, by the way, are what hurt American workers. And one of the reasons for the decline in wages actually has to do with the fact that we weren't keeping pace with the rest of the world. The big number everyone talks about is this one China study that found 2 million jobs. American manufacturing workers lost 2 million jobs because of what is called the China shock. Nobody read the study. That's over 15 years. Okay, that comes to about 150,000 jobs every year. Now, do you know how many jobs American workers lose every year through the normal churning of the American economy? 60 million. So this is 150,000 jobs out of 60 million that are lost every year through all kinds of reasons. Now, some of those are voluntary. People resign, people move locations. But even if you take it, there's a very good calculation done by the International Institute for International Economics. It basically comes to the conclusion that for every job lost to trade with China, there were 150 other jobs lost by American workers to technology, to productivity gains, to all kinds of other things. None of those people have been, none of those job losses have become the center of American political debate. And it's important to point out, when we talk about manufacturing jobs, because that's what we're talking about with China, those were the 2 million lost. Manufacturing has been a shrinking percent of the American workforce for 75 years. We've been going down, down, down. If you look at Germany, a country that has a trade surplus that supports manufacturing, manufacturing is at the heart of the German economy. The decline in manufacturing in Germany is the same as the United States, in some areas even worse. And guess what? What country is now seeing a decline in manufacturing jobs? China. Since 2012, manufacturing jobs have been declining in China. Why? Because as countries move up the economic ladder, they shift from goods-based economies to services. And when you move up into services, you're losing manufacturing jobs. We produce more. This is, again, one of the things people don't understand. We make more stuff than we ever did before. Manufacturing output in America is higher than it's ever been. We just need fewer people to do it.
I want to get to some of the soft power issues. Amanda from Los Angeles has asked a question about soft power. So if we could hear her question.
Hi, my name is Amanda Walensevich, and I have a question about American soft power. American cultural products, whether that's film, TV, or pop music, have allowed people around the world, and especially in China, to learn about American society and values. However, today it's becoming increasingly difficult to access American media in China. What might the long-term implications of this trend be? Or, to put it differently, what will happen if America continues to lose its ability to leverage its soft power in China?
It's a good question. Two forces are at work. One is that China has become more closed under Xi Jinping and is, in a sense, kind of decoupling itself from particularly the intellectual, cultural world in that way. I mean, you mentioned my books. Every one of my books was translated into mainland China until this last one. Before that, they would often ask for, edits. There's a few paragraphs on Mao. They would want to cut those out, and I would wrestle with it. And I came to the conclusion better to have it out there in China, and I would have them append a note saying this book has been specially edited for the Chinese market, with making it clear that this was an abridged version of the book. But that is no longer possible. So you can see a marked closing down of the Chinese system. The second piece that we should not underestimate is China is developing a huge popular culture of its own. So one of the things that I was struck by 10 years ago, this is when China was still very much opening up and liberalizing, was that you'd go to China and you'd talk to people there and you'd realize what we thought of as the biggest rock stars of the world, singers in the world, movie actors, they were unknown in China. The biggest movie, music people were all Chinese. They did know some of our very biggest people, Britney Spears or Madonna or Taylor Swift now and people like that. But the vast majority of the entertainment space is now Chinese, and that is happening all over the world. Bollywood movies are 95% of the Indian market now. Korean popular culture is massively popular, not just in Korea and other places. And this is, it's a wonderful phenomenon. You're seeing the rise of the rest, as I call it, the cultural renaissance of these places. Often they're copying a lot of American formats. So there's a Korean version of Friends and a Korean version of Modern Family and things like that, but in their own idiom and speaking their own language and things like that. And in that sense, we are losing a certain kind of cultural power. Look, the United States defined modernity for much of the world. When I was growing up in India, you watched American movies and sitcoms and music to understand what modernity was, because America was the face of modernity. Well, now modernity has many faces. There is a Chinese face to modernity. There's a Korean face to modernity. There is an Australian face, and that's a good thing. We want a society. We want a world in which lots of people are doing well. Our greatest soft power was the image and the strength of our democratic system. That's the one I worry about. I don't care if people are watching American sitcoms or watching Korean sitcoms. What I worry about is that people don't respect the American system of government as being something that at the end of the day, secretly, aspirationally, everybody thinks this is where we should get to. That was very much part of every country's DNA, other than Europe, of course, which has had its own path, but that we've lost.
We're not going to be able to get to nearly all of our questions. I had questions on Taiwan and other questions, but let me just close with two quick questions. One, from your perspective, what is one common sense recommendation you'd make to the leadership in either or both countries to improve the relationship going forward?
I'd probably do two. One is that they should set up more regular meetings between the senior officials. I am a strong believer in this, as Churchill said, better to jaw than war. Having actual contact would make a big difference. And I would say the second one is try to be sensible and commonsensical about the economic relationship, which is clearly can proceed on a win-win platform, which is to say it is better for Americans and it's better for Chinese people if we were able to trade more, to engage in more economic activity. Think of the opposite. Imagine if China collapsed as an economy right now. It would plunge the United States into a recession. Why is that good for us? Why is it good for us to have a world in which fewer people can buy and sell and invest? And so try to decouple that from the genuine and legitimate issues that you have about Chinese predatory behavior or South China Sea, as you say. Try to preserve there are positive parts of the relationship that are positive for both the citizens of the US and China and for the citizens of the world. Try to husband the good while also dealing with the bad.
Last question comes from Webster Lewing from New Jersey. And he asked something which will be asked at all of the 88 venues that are going to be watching this or that are watching this live. What can ordinary citizens do to prevent a new Cold War between the United States and China, as we discussed at the very beginning of this broadcast?
It's a great question, and it's a very difficult one to answer because, generally Americans don't vote on foreign policy. They essentially delegate foreign policy to the executive branch. Even Congress doesn't tend to get too involved, though on China they have gotten very involved. The average person, I think, my feeling has always been that we somehow don't get people who have common sense, who are practical, who are pragmatic, to be as energized, as vociferous, as active in the political sphere as the crazies. People who have passionate intensity on one side or the other, highly ideological, highly extreme views. Think of the primary voters in the Republican and the Democratic Party, who are usually 10% of the voting. And now we've gotten to the point where it's Twitter, which is 10% of that 10%. And somehow they frame the debate, they frame the dialogue, and everyone runs scared of getting a series of angry tweets from somebody or getting primary voters upset. But there's this vast middle of the country of people who are sensible, pragmatic, and I think for all those listening who I think are so inclined, you've got to get more active. You've got to approach this with the same level of intensity as the people on the far right and the far left, because if you don't do that, your voice gets drowned out. Your preferences are not taken seriously. And all I think people should be asking for is, let's just be sensible about this. There's a way to compete with China, to confront China, and to cooperate with China within an overall strategic relationship that recognizes we're not going anywhere and we're not going to give up on our values. But they also have, they're also going to have a place at the table. China has been around for 5,000 years. It's going to be around for a while.
I think that's a perfect way to end, because that's what the China Town Hall is all about. It's about getting Americans to learn about China, and when they learn about China, to learn more about China, learn more about what U.S.-China relations mean for them at home, and to take that information and talk to your congressman, talk to your senator, talk to your governor. And that's the point. And you have done a fabulous job in educating all of the folks who are watching us tonight. I thank you for engaging in this terrific conversation. And I want to thank our audience, too, for asking some terrific questions. Please be sure to visit the National Committee's website and YouTube channel for the full recording of this event and for our other excellent programming. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great, whether it's your morning, noon, or night, have a great day. And thank you again, Fareed.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, I think so. Right?
Beautiful day. We came, yeah, we've been here since 1:15. That hotel's not really nice. Spent a little time there and done.
Check, check. Hello? Yeah. So in theory, those microphones come in the same way this one. In a pinch.
That's what they do.
They'll make that rattling noise. All the time. You can turn them on just now. Yeah, but when they put them on, they make all that noise. The podium one's on. Oh, hello.
This is the Chinese language class for you that don't know it, and they learned that Ambassador was coming, so they wanted to prepare a greeting. Here they are.
That's probably the longest I've ever seen kids not be on Snapchat. So anyway, I'll call you guys up. I'll make introductions one by one here. Thank you everybody for being here. So now we have about 45 minutes left for a Q&A with Ambassador Brandstad. First of all, I want to thank Naomi, Dr. DeWinter, and MCC, Jeremy, everybody. I think this is the 4th year that MCC's hosted and coordinated the China Town Hall series, and she's always been awesome at getting it done for us. So we really appreciate that. And Chad as well here on the inside. Okay. So we have a great, Fareed Zarqawi, very impressive journalist, and I think, that was very interesting to hear a perspective. But in Muscatine, we always go up another level. So we've got the actual guy that was in the room where it happened. So we've got him here live tonight, and we can ask him questions. So without further ado, let's bring up Dr. DeWinter. She will be our moderator tonight, asking the questions. So Dr. DeWinter, you've been in Muscatine how many years? 6 years, and she is a huge asset. I think everyone from Muscatine knows it, but she is always positive energy for everything we ask her to do. She just moderated Jim Kim last week, so this is nothing new for her. So thank you, Dr. DeWinter. We're going to bring up Steve Churchill. Steve, come on up to one of these seats. So Steve is part of the Brandstad Churchill group, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but Steve's been involved with Governor Brandstad, Ambassador Brandstad for years. I think he said you've hired him 5 times over your career. And so Steve spent the full amount of time when Ambassador Brandstad was in China. Steve was right there running the embassy with him, and so he's a China expert as well. Can you hear me? Sarah Lande, why don't you come on up? Everybody locally obviously knows Sarah. She's kind of the matriarch of the Muscatine-China relationship. And obviously, I'm extremely thankful to Sarah for just all her energy for the Muscatine-China relations and all it's done for our community here locally. So thank you, Sarah. And then last but not least, Ambassador Brandstad. He's our longest serving governor. His biography is so long I can't read it all, but I think one of the best short writings about him is actually in the book that was written by Sarah and Joni Axel and Amy Bakke. So we've got 3 of the authors here tonight. But here's what they said. Governor Brandstad personifies the character of our state, hardworking, humble, and a listener. He loves Iowa. Terry Brandstad's the longest-serving governor in the history of the United States. He served as president of Des Moines University and acts as Iowa's advocate for agriculture, sharing Iowa's bounty with the world. Governor Brandstad's always seeking mutually beneficial paths for Iowa and its partners around the world. So we all know the story. We'll hear some of it tonight, but obviously Iowa owes a lot to Governor Brandstad for years and years of service, and then the country obviously owes him for the years of service as ambassador. So just feel lucky to have you all here tonight. I'm going to turn it over to the moderator, and hopefully you guys can think of some good questions. We'll have Q&A, and then we'll open it up to the whole group for Q&A. So thank you.
I think that mic can go to Ambassador Brandstad.
Okay.
Dan. Or are you? Oh, I'm sorry. You don't need to double mic. Then Sarah. Yes. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. Well, we're delighted to play a small part in hosting Ambassador Brandstad and Steve, and of course Sarah Lande here for the U.S.-China Town Hall again. I have to tell you, I was kind of hesitating about this opportunity until Sarah Lande was able to secure Ambassador Brandstad to come to Muscatine, and then we were all in. So of course we wouldn't miss this opportunity to welcome you back to Muscatine. In fact,
Great to be back. Thank you.
Yes, I had just gone through some photos of when you visited, when one of the Chinese orchestras performed.
2017.
2017, yes. Just before you went to China then as ambassador. Okay, so I think you mentioned earlier that President Trump believed that you were the right person to serve as ambassador to China. Explain to us how you came to be in that position, ambassador.
Well, it's kind of interesting for a farm boy from Iowa to end up being ambassador to China. But first, my goal was always to be governor of Iowa, and I got that great opportunity to serve a long time as governor. And one of the people that I called on to help me was Sarah Lande. She led the Iowa sister states, I think, for 10 years.
Yes, sir.
And we created a lot of sister states, and we traveled a lot of places. One of the places that we went was to establish a sister state in Hebei province of China. In my first year as governor, 1983, and my predecessor, Bob Ray, kind of laid the groundwork for this. He went to China, I think, in 82. In 83, I signed a sister state with Zhang Zhuguang, who was the governor of Hebei province in Des Moines. Now, he invited me to bring a delegation to China in 84, and we did. And we opened an office in Hong Kong, a trade office in Hong Kong. We went to Beijing, and it's so different than China today. No tall buildings, everybody's riding bicycles, they're wearing the old Mao's-type uniforms, and we rode a coal-fired steam locomotive to Shizhuang, the capital of Hebei province. They met us there with a band, gave my wife a big bouquet of flowers. We received a very warm welcome. And that was during the celebration of the 35th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, which was October 1, 1984. So in the next spring, a delegation of 5 young men from Hebei province came, led by Xi Jinping. And Sarah organized their trip, and we had a young man that had been an immigrant from Italy, Luca Baroni, graduated from Iowa State, worked for economic development, and he was put in charge of taking them all over Iowa. They went to birthday parties, they went to barbecues, they went out on the Mississippi River here in Dubuque, stayed with the Dvorak family, and Iowa, of course, we wanted to give them a really warm welcome and make them feel the Iowa friendliness and hospitality. Well, we accomplished that. So fast forward to, so I served 16 years as governor. I had a 12-year sabbatical. I was president of Des Moines University. They recruited me to come back and run for governor again in 2010. I won, decided I want to go back to China. Well, normally I'd get to meet with the governor or party secretary of Hebei province. I got to meet with Vice President Xi Jinping in the Great Hall of the People. So he'd moved up from being a county level party secretary to now being vice president of all of China. And that, of course, the Great Hall of the People is kind of the seat of government in Beijing, China. I would, as governor, only give people a half hour. He gave us 45 minutes, and he spent these he had his itinerary from the 85 trip. This is in 2011. And he went into great detail and mentioned by name Sarah Lande, Luca Baroni, the Dvorak family, and all these wonderful Iowans he'd met. He calls us old friends. And that, you know, it was very, and his interpreter was a woman named Li Xiaolin, who was in charge of the Chinese Association of Friendship with Foreign Peoples. So after the meeting with Xi Jinping, we had lunch with her. And she said, this is really genuine. He really loves Iowa. And so I decided I want to send him a thank you note and say, you know, next time you come to America, rumor was he'd be the next leader of China. Next time you come to America, I'd like to host an old friends reunion of the people you met in Iowa. And lo and behold, so that's October why I send the thank you note. In January, I get a call from the Chinese Consul General in Chicago. He says, I'm in my car on the way to Des Moines. Vice President Xi wants to come to Iowa. I want to work with you to make the arrangements. So I called Sarah Lande. I said, Sarah, would you and Roger host the Old Friends reunion at your home in Muscatine? And of course, Sarah agreed to it. And with the help of Joni Axel and the team she put together here, they did a phenomenal job. And then we had a state dinner at the Capitol in Des Moines with 1,600 people. We had the entire legislature, we had the Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, several business people, and a big delegation, maybe 300 from China that were there. And then the World Food Prize building, the World Food Prize hosted the high-level food and agriculture meeting the next morning, and then we had a visit to the Kimberly Farm. And now there's a Kimberly Friendship Farm in China. So because of that, and my son, my oldest son Eric, was in charge of the Trump campaign in the general election in 2016, and he told them about this long-term relationship with Xi Jinping in China. And so that's where Trump got the idea of appointing me ambassador. And so at the rally in Sioux City, the last rally before the election, and Sunday before the election, he called me back up on the stage, and he just said, well, Governor Brandstad can take care of China for us. Well, I had a trade mission planned to China and Japan leaving on Friday. So the election is not decided till early Wednesday morning. I leave on Friday, and then the speculation starts. I didn't think my wife's never going to agree to this. But I get back, and I found out that my 3 grown children had shown up at Terrace Hill, the governor's residence, and said, this is an opportunity of a lifetime. We'd all love to go to China. And don't turn it down. And so I get home, and my wife says, don't assume I'm against it. So then, right after I got back, there's a new governor's conference in Virginia. So on the way there, I stop in Washington, D.C. to meet with Reince Priebus and Mike Pence, who are in charge of the transition. And I said, well, I might have an interest in being ambassador to China. So the next day while I'm in Virginia, I get a call from Donald Trump. He said, 13 people want to be ambassador to China, but I think you'd be the best. So I said, well, I got to work this out with my family. But I'm going to be in New York next week for we do an economic development trip, and I'd be glad to meet with you at Trump Tower. And so we go there. My wife buys a new dress that wants to make a good impression when she meets with Donald Trump. But we get but she wears her leopard tights and traveling clothes.
Yes.
Well, because we're going to go to the hotel and change, but we get there and the New York trooper says, the schedule's been changed, you're going to have to go straight to Trump Tower. So she doesn't get the change. We go straight to Trump Tower. We finally get in there. I had met Donald Trump Jr. before because he'd come out I'd invite him to the governor's deer hunt, and I met Jared Kushner for the first time and many of the other key advisors. And we get there in front of, and of course, Trump's office overlooks Central Park, and he's got all of these plaques and honors that he's received on all the walls and on the chairs along the windows and everything. And we get there, and we're sitting in front of his desk, and he looks not at me but my wife, and he says, you want to do this? And my wife says, yes. He says, you've got it. That's it. That's how I got appointed. But then, of course, you have to go through confirmation. So this was in December. He'd been elected but hadn't been inaugurated. So then on Inauguration Day, he appointed me, and then I had to go through confirmation, go before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and both Senator Grassley and Senator Ernst introduced me. And I had watched some of the hearings for some of the other people. This is going to be really tough. But it wasn't as bad as I thought. And I was confirmed, and actually then I think was confirmed on the 21st of May and then sworn in on the 23rd. And of course I had to resign first as governor, Kim Reynolds, and then sworn in as ambassador, and Kim Reynolds was sworn in as governor. It's a long story, but I wanted to give you the whole, how it happened.
What's interesting is that he said he was sworn on May 21st? The new ambassador to China has been named, but has not gone through or even begun Senate confirmation yet. And so that means, they may be lucky to have someone in China
by the end of the year.
The end of the year, coming up on the one-year anniversary of the Biden administration. So it's a much different process, and I think we were lucky to have you on the ground as early as we did at that time.
Well, Nick Burns is the person that's been designated to be the next. I had a telephone conversation with him. It lasted for over an hour. He is a retired diplomat, and he's now teaching at the Kennedy School at Harvard. But we had a really good conversation, and then I said, I'm going to send you Sarah Lande's book. I sent him your book. Oh, I said, it's in both Mandarin and English, and it really tells the story of Xi Jinping in Iowa. So he's got that information. So.
Well, then he'll be set to go.
Yeah. Well, I thought that would be a big help to him.
That's great.
He sent me a nice thank you note for it.
Let's take some questions from the audience. I want to make sure to have enough time to do that. Are there any questions from our audience tonight? Yes.
I'll ask one. I'm just curious, and I've said this a few times, about what I thought about your openness in signing the first sister state agreement with the province of China, the very first one. And China had only been opened up since
Right.
Right? It was only 4 years later. Do you remember any of your thoughts around that?
Well, Deng Xiaoping, Mao was gone. That was a very bad time in China. You know, you had the Great Leap Forward, and it's estimated 25 to 35 million people starved to death. Then you had the Cultural Revolution. They closed the colleges and universities and sent the professors out to work in the fields under the instruction of the peasants. And so China had gone through some very difficult times. Then along comes Deng Xiaoping, and he says, it's all right to become rich. It's all right to be entrepreneurial. And they began to open up and really change China. So we were very optimistic that the future could be very bright and China could become very more open and reformed. And so it was, the timing I think was right to do that. Plus, it's a huge country with a lot of people, and we felt it had potential to grow. And if it grew, and they don't have nearly the quality of land we have in Iowa. So we saw market opportunities to sell American agriculture products to a growing Chinese market. And that has way exceeded what we imagined it could be back in 1983. Also, we just saw an opportunity to get to know different people in different culture, to learn about their history, their education system, their music, and all of those things. And you know, Sarah was very involved in this as we worked to develop relationships in, you know, every area, not only in trade but in culture and medicine and in education and music, all of those things.
And Sarah, can you talk more about your initial involvement? What inspired you to get so involved?
Well, that's sort of interesting, and I'll sort of go back to one of Ambassador Brandstad said, when we first went over, well, when he went over in '83, but because we didn't have Twitter and Facebook and social media, some of us didn't even realize the historic past that Xi Jinping's family had been. I think it was maybe in 1979, your governor, when you were vice governor, Bob Ray, went to China leading a group with other governors. And the next year, Xi Jinping's father, who was a governor of a province then, came back with a group of governors to Iowa. But at that, we didn't go back on that too much. I think, you know, we researched that much more after that. But I'll have to say real quickly how I got involved, where Joni and I and some other people had been studying in University Women all about China opening up. And we had a teacher, Catherine Miller, she probably taught here, who taught us Zhou Enlai, Mao Zedong, and so forth. So we were curious about it. And then after the Sister State Agreement was signed in 1983, there was an article in the paper that said our former governor, Bob Ray, and his wife were leading a trip to China, International Friendship Force, for 3 weeks. All you had to do was call in the paper, this article, if you wanted to. That's Iowa. So raise your hand and got an interview. So I was going, I said to Joni, well, guess what I'm going to do next year? I'm going to go to China. Oh, I want to go too. So Joni and I both went on that 3-week trip. As you said, Ambassador, only Mao jackets, everybody's on a bicycle. And we really fell in love with it all. And when we came back, then Governor Brandstad sort of established an Iowa sister state board or something to help manage these relationships. So there was an article in the Des Moines Register that said, anyone interested in serving on the board of Iowa sister states, call in. And it was David Oman, you know, you're chief
Chairman,
of
Chief of
staff for
Staff.
Pierre. Yeah? Oh, are you interested? Sure. So that's how I got involved, and I love people from other countries. And anyway, we did a lot with China, but we did a lot with
With other
Russia.
countries.
And remember when we had the one with Veneto region of Italy, when you and Chris came down the Grand Canal to sign the agreement. So we've had fun in China and opened up the doors.
When we established a sister state with the Veneto region of Italy, I had people say to me, you finally wised up and have a sister state where the food is really good. I can tell you, though, the food is really good in China as well.
Oh, gosh, isn't it delicious?
Yeah. We got to really enjoy. We had a Chinese chef at the ambassador's residence, and we ate with chopsticks. But when we hosted events, then we would serve American food, and ice cream is hard to get and is expensive in China. So my wife got a homemade machine to make. She made homemade ice cream. So we would serve Chris's homemade ice cream at all those events.
Yeah. So anyway, it's been an interesting ride. And I think, Ambassador, you just personify a genuine, good, wise, curious person. You've welcomed all the Iowans that came over. Oh, could we visit the embassy? Oh, sure. Oh, sure. After you get through all the guardrails and things like that to get in. But you welcomed us, and you made us feel good about Iowa and China. And how many other provinces did you visit when you were there?
There are 31 provinces and autonomous regions in China. My goal was to do as I did as governor, get to all of them. But I got to 26 before COVID shut down travel. I did get to Tibet. We got to Heilongjiang up in the north, went to the ice festival. My grandchildren love the ice festival. And we were treated so well. One of the reasons I think we were treated so well there, the party secretary in Heilongjiang used to be the governor of Hebei. So
okay.
Unlike the United States, where, you know, the governor of Iowa is usually an Iowan. In China, Xi Jinping if somebody is doing a good job as governor of a particular province, he may promote them to party secretary in a bigger province. Yeah. And so they get moved around. It's very different than it is here. But all those people, they knew that I was the one that signed the original sister state with Hebei province. So I was treated like a rock star every time I went to Hebei province. And so it was a wonderful experience from that. And especially the Chinese people are very gracious and very nice, and they treated us very well, and we made a lot of friends.
Yeah. Let me tell you sort of another funny Iowa story, and I guess you could go in. As you know, Governor Brandstad had such a good relationship with Xi Jinping for when he came back. So an interesting thing, after they came in 2012, they invited the old friends back. And then they, of course, had a wonderful banquet. You know, they entertain you. If Xi Jinping likes you and things, you're living the high life. But I had an opportunity to sit next to his wife, who was lovely and beautiful. And she said, well, I just had to come down and figure out what my husband thinks so much about the people of Iowa. I said, what is it about them, you know? And all that went on all the time. And I think the last time I was over there, I don't know, I guess it was the beginning of 20, maybe the 70th anniversary of, I'm not sure.
The 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic.
And they did that
October
up front.
1. Yeah.
Yes.
October of 2019, right?
Yeah, 2019.
Yes, and there was something, Dan, when we were there, I don't know, at the first of the year. But anyway, we had this banquet, and Xi Jinping's wife hosted us, and everybody got to tell what they were doing in China. And her closing remarks were, well, when we retire, I'm going to get my daughter, and we're coming to Muscatine, Iowa. I couldn't believe it anyway. So somehow, different people, even talking with Jim Kemp, said, well, why did he like Iowa? And so we said, I don't know. Maybe we liked him really well, and it just worked.
Well, I think they treated us well, and we treated them very well.
Sure.
So I think the friendliness and hospitality, which is kind of natural to Iowans, and I think everybody that you help recruit to make that a success. So, and I want you to know, one of the great honors that I received as ambassador, when I presented my credentials. Now, every new ambassador to a country presents their credentials to the leader of that country. So I did that in July of 2017, and I had a kind of a private conversation with President Xi, and he said he had seen the press conference when I arrived with my wife and daughter and son-in-law and 2 granddaughters. And he said, my wife and I would like to host you and your whole family that's here in China to dinner with us. And he did that.
Wow.
I don't know that's ever been done for an American ambassador before, but President Xi Jinping, Madam Peng, his wife, and their 25-year-old daughter hosted us to a dinner on January 30th of 2018. And so that's got to be for my granddaughters one of the biggest thrills of their life, really. They sang a little song, because they've learned some Mandarin. They sang a little song in Mandarin to
For him, too.
Yeah.
Like they're great.
And you know what they do in their school now? They go, my daughter teaches at the International School of Beijing, and whenever one of the kids has a birthday, they sing it in Mandarin, in Korean, and in English.
Wow. That would be. Okay, Heidi, we want the songs in 3 languages now.
I'll bet you could do it.
Another
it's not
question?
That hard. Yes,
yeah, Dan.
I'm curious about the day-to-day operations of an embassy. I know the embassy in Beijing is enormous.
Yes.
Is there an average day, or what kind of tasks are you guys doing?
Well, we would have basically a staff meeting of the top leaders every day, and we had 49 different agencies there. So we had every branch of the American military. We had the FBI, the CIA, of course the State Department, the Commerce Department, agriculture, education, energy, Health and Human Services, you name it. We had them all. And so then
the largest U.S. embassy in the world.
And it's got 5. It had 5 consulates.
People.
When Mike Pompeo decided to close to get the president to order the Chinese to close their consulate in Houston, the Chinese, we knew they'd retaliate. And I called Mike Pompeo and I said, they're going to retaliate. I'm afraid they'll close Guangzhou. We've got some really sensitive stuff there. But my legal counsel said, no, they'll choose a comparable size consulate, Chengdu. And sure enough, the Chinese required us to close Chengdu. So this is after we had sent, because of COVID, we sent back 1,300 American employees and their families to the United States. So the Consul General in Chengdu, he'd been there without his wife and children for about 7 months. And then this comes up. And so I told him, he was set to go back to the United States, and I says, you're not going back. You need to be there to oversee the closing of the consulate. And he said, would you call my wife? So I did. I called his wife and said, yeah, he needs to stay there through the closing of the consulate. And so I made that. That was one of the more difficult calls. But
I would say in terms of the mission in China, really impressive. You know, we're not career diplomats, so we were learning, and we weren't sure how we would be accepted. They really liked the ambassador. You know, governors are CEOs, senators are not usually from a CEO background, so I like the fact that he was really focused. And with 2,700 people, he said, Steve, one of the things I want to do is make sure that we focus on measurable results. And so we, every 3 years, would have to write an integrated country strategy because I want it to be between 3 and 5 things. I want it measurable. And I have people all the way to the very end and say, you know, I've never had a leader that was so precise and so determined and relentless every day in terms of what are we doing to move these. And so I think he made a difference to a lot of those career diplomats in terms of this is important. It's important to be able to know what success looks like. But it was a really talented team. You have to take pass an exam to join the Foreign Service. Some people have to take it 2 or 3 times. So they're all talented. It's very regimented. It's very much hierarchical like the military in terms of how they report. It's all up or out. Either you advance or you find a new job. And so, you know, most places I've worked, about a third are outstanding, a third are not good, and a third are have potential. There was not one person there that wasn't outstanding, and they really serve America well.
One of the other things that I did, and I learned this when I became the president of Des Moines University. You know, I'm not a doctor, and I'm not an academic, and the trustees chose me because I was on the board of trustees, and they chose me to be the president of Des Moines University. I'm immediately suspect from the faculty because I'm not one of them. And so I won them over, and the way I did it, I'd have lunch in the cafeteria with the faculty. And to get to know them, I had an open door policy and listened to their concerns. And I shared with them, the chairman of the board of trustees, when he asked me to apply to be president of Des Moines University, he said, we're looking for somebody to raise the visibility, respect and recognition of the school, raise money for the school, and manage and oversee the operation. And so I didn't micromanage. I worked with, so we had 3 college deans and a research dean. So we worked with them, and Steve was the legal not the legal counsel. Steve was the vice president for development and alumni relations. But we met every week, and we didn't take votes. We would just bring things back until we had a consensus. We didn't, and that's how we did it. And so when I decided to retire as the president of Des Moines University and run for governor again, I did an annual State of the University report and question and answer with the faculty. And the president of the faculty said, you know, I hate to see you leave. You did exactly what you said you would do. You're the best leader we've ever had. And I'm a Democrat, but I'm going to support you for governor because we need leadership. That's when I knew I'd won over the faculty. And so I thought, okay, if that worked there at Des Moines University, I got back as governor, I'd have lunch in the cafeteria and with the public and with the legislators and lobbyists, and it worked there. So when I got to Beijing, I did the same thing. I'd have lunch in the cafeteria, and then when we had to send all those people back, Steve would help me, and we would invite certain people to go out on weekend to have dinner with Steve and I and my wife, Chris. And so we got to know.
During COVID, we sent 80% of our workforce back. So we were down to a skeleton
of our Americans. We did have Chinese.
Right. But a lot of the Chinese didn't come in because they were really concerned about getting COVID. And so we really had a skeleton crew. And we were down to 20%, but then that became eroded over time. So it was a nice opportunity to get to know people on a different level. And so we really were able to do that. But, you know, back to the lunch thing, that might seem like no big deal to me. Well, let's have lunch in the cafeteria, who cares? But his predecessor, who was ambassador there for almost 3 years, never once during the time that he was there did he have lunch in the cafeteria. So it's a bigger deal than you realize to connect with people.
Ambassador, you mentioned that you had a conversation with the new ambassador.
Yes, Nick Burns.
Nick, okay.
He's going to be the next ambassador. He's still got to go through confirmation.
Yes. So did you give him any advice in terms of priorities or, you know, if I were you, I would?
I shared with him the idea of having a focused agenda that Steve talked about. You can't do everything. Focus on what matters most. And then I also encouraged him to get out once the COVID situation gets better and he can travel, but to get out and meet leaders in the provinces all over China, because those will be future leaders in China, and it would be good to get to know them. And obviously, it's a big country, and it's a diverse country, and so I thought that was, and also I shared with him that the previous 3 ambassadors had all given me some good advice. John Huntsman, Gary Locke, and Max Baucus all served as ambassador. Max Baucus in particular, his wife actually, Melody Haynes, used to be a prosecutor in Des Moines, Iowa.
Oh, really?
So she had a Des Moines connection, and Melody and Max were very helpful to Chris and I in giving us advice, and so I offered that. Yes, Joni.
Just because we're here with these wonderful students who are Chinese language learners, tell us a little bit about your translator or laters.
Oh boy. We had probably the greatest translator of all time. His name is James Brown. He was and if you see pictures of American presidents meeting with a Chinese leader, you'll see him in the background. He interpreted for every American president from Jimmy Carter through Donald Trump. And he was my interpreter, and not only did he interpret, but sometimes the Chinese interpreter, and his command of Mandarin was so good that the Chinese would often compliment me on his ability on the Chinese language. But he would also privately tell me, sometimes if he didn't think the Chinese interpreter said things quite the way they were said. So he would tell me what they really meant. So he not only interpreted, he he gave me some really pretty sage advice. He's now retired, but and we had a woman interpreter the last probably 6 months that I was there. But
during the times when Xi Jinping was here in 2012 and then after, at least when I was around, he always had the same translator. I don't know whether translator or interpreter. I'm not sure which word.
Right.
Interpreter for when you are repeating what someone says and maybe translating maybe the written word.
Anyway, so I just noticed, and that was always the person who stood right behind.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Xi Jinping knows a lot of English, but he always worked with his interpreter. Yeah. Even when we had that dinner with him and his wife and daughter.
You never hear him say a word in English, really. We never did. Even though we knew he understood, he never, the most basic of greetings, they were always in Mandarin.
But is that a State Department kind of expectation that you speak your language, your own language?
Not necessarily. When for instance, Zhang Shuguang, who was my counterpart with the Chinese Department of, what is it called?
MFA?
Yeah. Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's a deputy, and I think he's now ambassador to Great Britain. But he could speak English very well. Right. And he had been at the embassy in Washington, D.C. Right. And sometimes he spoke in English, sometimes he spoke in Mandarin. If he really wanted to deliver something that's unpleasant, or that he wanted to really drive home some points, he'd do it in Mandarin. Sometimes if it was more personal, it would do it in English. But we had a good relationship. But, they have what they call a démarche. A démarche is when they give you a chewing out for something that...
Register a complaint.
Yeah, somebody in the administration or somebody in Congress had said or done something, and I had to deliver that message back to the administration, and then I would respond with our position. Try to do it in a firm but diplomatic way.
I think we have a question here from Glad.
I have a question to ask. You know, now the relation between China and the U.S. is different from 5 years before.
Yep.
So how do you think the future?
Well, it's a difficult situation. I think many of us have been disappointed that Xi Jinping has been more hardline than we would like. We thought that he'd be more like his father, more like Deng Xiaoping as a reformer and more opening up. But he has given the Communist Party more authority, and he has taken a tougher position. Of course, we've been disappointed with the mistreatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. We've been very unhappy with what happened in Hong Kong, where, you know, it was supposed to be one country, two systems, but they've lost freedom of speech and assembly and independent judiciary. So it's of concern. There's no question, though, that Xi Jinping is a very astute leader. One of the first things he did is he cracked down on corruption in the Communist Party, and he put Liu He in charge of that. And Liu He is a trusted advisor of his. He also, and we started at the embassy measuring the quality of air in Beijing, which was very bad. And at first they objected, but eventually the Chinese have their government has taken that on, and they have made, in the 3 years I was there, every year the air pollution got better. Still have a ways to go, but it's got a lot better than it used to be. And those are things that he's accomplished. He's also focusing on trying to reduce the disparity between the rich cities in eastern China and some of the poorer rural areas in other parts of China. So I try to take a balanced view. He's done some good things. I sure don't like some of the things that he's done that I think are more harsh, and surveillance is really a big problem over there. They spend more money on domestic surveillance than they do on national defense. And now they have this, what do they call it, social scoring. Social scoring. So if you say something critical of the leadership or the Communist Party, you may be denied being able to go on a fast-speed train or on an airplane or get a visa. So, and they have the most sophisticated facial recognition, and so anything you say and do is probably heard, even including to our residents. We didn't assume that we had any privacy.
Especially your residents.
So do you think, can we find a win-win system between China and the U.S.?
I think we can. Well, one of the areas of win-win is the area of trade, and it was a long, hard battle, and I guess I disagree with what the CNN gentleman said about tariffs, because I think it was the tariffs that got China's attention that eventually led to the Phase 1 trade agreement, and that has meant huge purchases of corn, soybeans, pork, and we also got the market open for beef and chicken. Also, and it's not as quick as we'd like, but they're opening up to investments in financial services. Companies like Principal Financial Group could do tremendous work over there. And so there's those kinds of opportunities, and we need to, and also one of our challenges has been protecting intellectual property rights. And the Phase 1 trade agreement does things to protect intellectual property rights. Again, some provinces is better than others, but progress is being made.
But I think it's going to be really challenging because we're two different systems with very different forms of government and really different values. You know, the Chinese government, and I think many of the people, value stability. and particularly the Communist Party wants stability. What do you think the #1 value in the United States is?
Independence, right?
Freedom, liberty,
by
opportunity.
its nature is less stable in terms of predicting. You know, it's a forum for free expression, a lot of different things. That makes the Chinese very nervous. So our very premise of who we are and why we exist is so different. And, you know, when I was in China, I tried to get a sense of what was important to people, but you didn't really have people talking about freedom. Now, maybe it's because they knew they were listened to, but what I heard people talking about was good education for their kids, economic prosperity continue to grow as it has, and they want a clean environment. But the whole notion, we just assume that everyone wants what we want, independence and freedom. That's the most important. But I didn't hear that. Maybe they were afraid to say it to me, but it wasn't a part of everyday discourse. The other thing that I thought was interesting that in China was almost every day, certainly every week, I'll get into discussion about politics. What someone thinks about who's running for mayor or this or that. There was no discussion ever about politics in China because they're not stakeholders. They're not voters, and so they're not thinking, what do you think about this or that? They're thinking about their daily lives, and maybe they're trying to work around the government. How do I get things done? But it's not the same investment as we had here, and I thought that was really interesting and much different than I expected.
You're saying there's no market for the yard signs then in
No,
China?
no market for yard
no
signs.
market, yeah.
But they
got them all over Muscatine, but there's no market for them there.
What they do have, and the ambassador, I didn't understand it, but every time we go by it, one of the language officers say that's propaganda. Lots of propaganda in Chinese. Now, we didn't know, we're like, whatever, but lots of propaganda reinforcing the importance of the Chinese Communist Party and the better life that they're providing. It is around you every day being reinforced. So I thought that was really interesting.
You know, Steve and Ambassador, both Dan and I think because of relationships, get the China Daily. Do you get it now?
No, I don't get it. We got it when I was ambassador, but I don't now.
Yeah, I don't know. We get it. Yeah.
Delivered to your front door?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, and sometimes I'm going to give it to the Chinese kids, class.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So
Well,
you.
we tried to get several editorials that the ambassador had written,
Yes,
published in
that's
China
right.
Daily, but they always wanted to change things, and so we were not. We did not want to change what he was saying, and so I don't know that we ever got one in there, but we did try to do that.
Yeah.
That's the difference. You know, the Chinese ambassador could write and get opinions published in American publications. We could not do that in China. Also, he could visit universities, and that's one thing that Mike Pompeo said, we want fairness and reciprocity. So if the Chinese are going to treat us this way, then they need to be treated that way. And so that was one of the things that he did that was somewhat controversial, but it was really a matter of reciprocity and fairness.
Mm-hmm. Do you think they're, Ambassador, do you think they're young people who are cut away from freedom? I agree sort of what Steve said. Just how tight can it get that the young people over there will rebel a little bit, or not really?
I don't think that's a problem because their whole education system, their whole media reinforces the greatness of Xi Jinping, the Communist Party, and all the improvements that have been made. And they think back, their grandparents' generation, people were starving to death.
Sure.
Then you had the Cultural Revolution, and they closed the colleges and universities. And I think the younger people today say, well, gosh, we've got it so much better than it was previously. So,
And they may, honestly, they may look at America, you know, at one time we just assumed that when countries are developing, they're going to want democracy and freedom, right? That's just to be assumed. That is a gold standard. But I don't think you can assume that anymore. You know, people may say, well, a government that has a little bit of authoritarianism, you know, the Asian countries and in Africa, maybe that's the way to get things done, and we'll have some degree of freedom, but we want to be able to cut through it. Democracy seems sloppy. It seems messy. How do they handle different things? So some of those things that we just assumed were the gold standard, it may not be so much anymore. And China is very confident right now. And I noticed just in the 3 years, the nationalism is very prevalent. People are feeling very confident. At one time, the Chinese really relied on Wall Street in terms of how we're going to get things done. And after they saw the crisis to 2008, they stopped relying on the United States. They were emboldened. And so they still need U.S. technology. They are not innovators like we are, or don't have the capacity to do that. That's what sets us apart. But I don't think they care as much about what we think. They want to have a good relationship, but they're going to do what they think is in their own interests and take their lumps and move forward. Whereas at one time, I think they really cared about how we thought. I do not think that they care. They're going to do what's in their interest, and guess what? We're going to do what's in our interest, too. That's what every country does, but they have a different level of confidence now.
I think you two are lucky to have each other.
Well, we've worked together in a lot of different capacities over the years, and Steve was my chief of staff, so he helped me a great deal to get done what we were able to accomplish there. And you know, the ambassador works at the pleasure of the president, and I saw what happened to the Canadian ambassador when he got crosswise with Prime Minister Trudeau. He was back in Canada, and he didn't even get to come back to China to move out. His wife had to move him out, and they were good friends of ours. But so I guess I'm proud of the fact that I survived the whole time and was not fired.
It's probably easier to be CEO of a state as governor than ambassador, because CEO, you're making your own decisions, but ambassador, you have to deliver messages which you probably agree with most of the time, but you may not always entirely agree, but you still have to deliver that message. And some of the messages were tough. This was a difficult time.
Plus, sometimes the Chinese would do something and I'd want to respond, but I had to clear it with the State Department. And by the time I got it cleared, it was old news. It was 4 or 5 days later. And you know, there's a 12-hour time difference, and they just weren't as quick as we thought they should have been at the State Department to answer our inquiries. So, you know, we did the best we could.
Ambassador Brandstad, Sarah Lande, Steve Churchill, we thank you so much from Muscatine.
Thank you.
Thank you for your service to Iowa. Thank you for your service to our country. And we will continue to do our part with citizen diplomacy, learning, and serving our community and our state.
Next time we come, we're going to stay in that hotel. That's a beautiful hotel.
Oh, yeah. You made me sorry.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, this was fun. And there was good questions. And
spend more time with you next time around.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Thanks.
We're going to hit the road
touch.
because we've got a long drive.
Yeah.
So those cookies we want to see.
hey, good to see you again.
I really want to thank you for coming.
So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
If you're ever in Des Moines, be sure to look us up. If we can ever help with anything, let us know. Okay?